Everyone knows that Brasília is the capital of Brazil. But what if I told you that it was never meant to be built? At least not when it was. What if I told you that a decision affecting millions of lives, billions in infrastructure, and the geopolitical orientation of an entire country was accelerated by a dust storm? This is not a metaphor. This is the true story of how, in 1954, a particularly inconvenient swirl of dust in the air nudged the gears of history in a direction they might not have gone for another decade. Or ever. And like all good mysteries, it starts with a problem no one wanted to deal with, until it became impossible to ignore. In the early 1950s, Brazil was a nation torn between its coast and its interior. The country's beating heart was Rio de Janeiro, a coastal jewel filled with music, glamour, and politics. But behind the samba rhythm was a problem that plagued generations of Brazilian leaders: over-centralization. With nearly everything from government offices to media power clustered on the coast, the vast interior of the country remained underdeveloped, disconnected, and largely forgotten. For decades, the idea of building a new inland capital had been floated. In fact, the Brazilian Constitution of 1891 explicitly called for it. Yet, for over 60 years it remained just that, an idea. No money, no urgency, no political will. That changed on a single bizarrely hot day in 1954. President Getulio Vargas was already facing tremendous political pressure. His presidency was on shaky ground and tensions in Rio were escalating. But that afternoon, during a key government session in the Palácio do Catete, something strange happened. The windows were flung open to let in some breeze, but instead, a fine yellowish-brown dust began coating everything. Papers, desks, even the coffee cups. Rio had long suffered from periodic sand and dust events blown in from dry inland regions. But this one was different. It was thicker, longer lasting, and most importantly, it interrupted a crucial budget meeting. The room was evacuated. The air conditioning units clogged, equipment broke, and tempers flared. Later that day, an offhand comment was made by one of the ministers. Maybe the interior wouldn't be so dusty. It was a joke, but it landed harder than expected. Because in that moment, a dusty inconvenience turned into a political opportunity. That night, in his private notes, Vargas scribbled a single phrase. "The coast is crumbling. Maybe it's time to look inward." Was this really the beginning? Could a swirling cloud of dust, an ordinary atmospheric hiccup, have triggered one of the most ambitious urban relocation projects of the 20th century? Or was it just the last straw in a long list of ignored signs? Let's rewind, because to understand how Brasília rose from nothing, we need to understand why so many people were suddenly desperate for change, and why the dust simply made it undeniable. To understand how a gust of dust could tip a nation's destiny, we need to rewind far earlier than that strange day in 1954. Because the seeds of Brasília were planted not in a sandstorm, but in a centuries-old fear: invasion. Since colonial times, Brazil's coastal cities, especially Rio and Salvador, had been vulnerable to attack by sea. Pirates, European rivals, and even the French had tried their luck. And while Brazil's territory extended deep into the continent, its political and economic life clung stubbornly to the Atlantic coast. In theory, an inland capital would be safer, more secure, and more symbolically national. But for over a century, this idea remained a mirage, spoken of with pride, funded with reluctance, and postponed indefinitely. In 1891, Brazil's newly drafted Republican Constitution included a curious clause. The capital, it said, would one day be moved to a new location in the center of the country, a symbolic break from the imperial past. But symbols are cheap, and infrastructure is not. No serious attempt was made. Rio remained the capital, growing denser and more chaotic by the year. Over the decades, commissions were formed, reports were written, and maps were drawn. Yet every proposal to relocate the capital was eventually buried, by politics, by logistics, or by sheer inertia. Then came the post-war years. By the 1950s, Brazil was experiencing rapid industrialization and with it, growing pains. Rio de Janeiro had become a bottleneck, overcrowded, expensive, and increasingly disconnected from the country's interior, where development was lagging behind. A few visionary politicians like José Bonifacio and Washington Luiz had warned about this imbalance for decades, but their warnings rarely gained traction. The Northeast was drying out, the Amazon was isolated, and the interior, known as the Sertão, remained a mystery to most urban Brazilians. It was the heart of Brazil, they said, but a heart no one had ever seen, until someone did. In 1953, a team of geographers, engineers, and bureaucrats known as the Mission Cruels was quietly reactivated. They were tasked with finding the perfect spot for a hypothetical capital, a location that was geologically stable, climatically pleasant, and politically neutral. They found it on a high plateau in the Goiás region, windswept, empty, and hauntingly beautiful. But still, nothing moved. Reports sat on desks, maps gathered dust. Until, ironically, that same dust decided to escape the map and infiltrate the corridors of power. The meeting disrupted by the dust storm wasn't just about money, it was about national direction. In that room were key players from multiple ministries, including planning, finance, and transportation. For weeks, they had been deadlocked on the question of investment priorities. Should the government double down on coastal ports and industry, or redirect resources inland? The answer had been elusive, buried in graphs and debates, until the room itself became uninhabitable. It was as if the country's neglected interior had sent a physical reminder of its presence and of the cost of ignoring it. That night, Vargas wasn't the only one who took notes. Minister of Transport Lucas Lopes scribbled in his planner, "Interiorization = inevitability." That phrase would resurface in a speech less than a year later, one that would stir the imagination of a rising political star. But more on him in a moment. First, we need to look at what happened next. Because once the idea of moving the capital re-entered political conversation, it evolved rapidly, from a theoretical project to a ticking clock. And like all things in politics, the shift wasn't just about ideology. It was also about legacy, ambition, and revenge. The man who picked up that idea and turned it into action was Juscelino Kubitschek, a charismatic doctor-turned-politician whose vision for Brazil was as expansive as its geography. By the mid-1950s, Kubitschek was running for president with a bold promise: move the capital to the interior and build a new city from scratch. Not in a decade, not eventually, but now. He called it his 50 Years of Progress in 5 plan, a sweeping campaign to industrialize, integrate, and modernize Brazil. But behind the optimism was a real sense of urgency. The coastal elites were clinging to power. The infrastructure was crumbling, and the country was quite literally being choked by its geography. So Kubitschek played his ace, Brasília, a capital that didn't yet exist, but already lived in the constitution and the minds of those who had seen the storm. And here's the twist. It wasn't just about location. It was about control. By placing the capital far from the centers of resistance, away from Rio's bureaucracy, Sao Paulo's economic dominance, and the oligarchs of the Northeast, Kubitschek could reset the chessboard. Brasília would be more than a city. It would be a symbol of rebirth, of central authority, of federal neutrality, and perhaps most importantly, a political firewall against the regional tensions threatening to split the country apart. But to make this happen, he needed something more powerful than laws or speeches. He needed myth. And the storm, that long-forgotten sand-laced wind that had disrupted a budget meeting and stained the curtains of Vargas's palace, became part of that myth. Kubitschek's speeches began referencing the voice of the interior. His advisors whispered stories of that day in 1954 when the sky turned red and the capital's lungs were filled with dust. It became a metaphor for urgency and a rallying cry. The people didn't want another committee. They wanted a monument, a miracle. So Kubitschek didn't just push the plan, he accelerated it. In 1956, the site was chosen. The lines were drawn. And then, impossibly fast, construction began. Over 60,000 workers, many of them poor migrants known as candangos, descended on the arid plateau of Goiás to build something no one had seen before, a futuristic city in the middle of nowhere. The landscape they encountered was not forgiving. Scorching days, freezing nights, scarcity of water, and dust. So much dust. It coated their boots, their tools, their lungs. The very thing that had pushed the capital out of Rio now covered the bones of its replacement. And while politicians in Rio scoffed, calling the project delusional, a vanity experiment, Kubitschek kept building. He brought in Oscar Niemeyer for the architecture and Lucio Costa for the urban plan. The result? A city shaped like an airplane, or a bird, or a cross depending on who you ask. But the symbolism was clear. Brasília would fly above the old divisions, above the coast, above the past. It would not grow out of history. It would be poured, molded, and born new. By 1960, just 4 years later, Brasília was officially inaugurated as Brazil's capital. Flags were moved, government offices packed, And in the span of a single presidential term, the unimaginable had become concrete. Literally. Yet beneath the shimmering modernist facades and sweeping esplanades, something more subtle was happening. A shift, a recentering, and an unintended consequence that would take decades to fully unfold. Because when you uproot a capital, you don't just move buildings, you move influence, you move gravity, and sometimes you move problems to places that never asked for them. But here's where our investigation takes a deeper turn. Because while Brasília rose like a monument to progress, it also became a case study in unintended consequences. From the moment the capital moved, a slow but powerful shift began. One that would alter Brazil's political culture, regional dynamics, and even its patterns of inequality. By detaching the seat of government from the country's economic and cultural centers, Brazil created a curious paradox: a capital with power, but no people. A city of grand ministries and empty streets, of monumental scale and minimal participation. And it began to show. The original promise was to unify Brazil, to draw the nation inward, to populate the empty middle, to bridge the gap between coast and hinterland. But instead, Brasília became something else, a bubble, physically isolated and politically insulated. The very design that was meant to symbolize transparency, those sweeping open spaces, the glass buildings, the symmetrical layout, ended up distancing the government from its citizens. Unlike Rio or São Paulo, where politicians couldn't escape the press, the public, or even traffic, Brasília was quiet, controlled, sterile. It created a political class that over time became less tethered to public pressure. Senators and ministers who once walked down crowded avenues now rode in air-conditioned convoys between buildings that were deliberately spaced apart. Meetings became more internal. Protests had to be shipped in by bus. Over decades, this bred a culture of detachment, one that would be painfully exposed during Brazil's many political crises, from the military dictatorship of the 1960s to the corruption scandals of the 2010s. In a cruel twist of irony, the capital that was supposed to democratize the republic ended up centralizing power in a way no one fully anticipated. And then there's the economic angle. Brasília's construction did boost development in the Central West region, yes. Roads were built, new cities emerged, but it also diverted massive resources away from existing urban centers that were already struggling. The Northeast, long-promised federal investment, saw less. The Amazon region remained neglected. In trying to balance the country, the pendulum swung too far in one direction. The city's futuristic skyline may have inspired awe, but it did little for favelas in Rio or drought-ridden farms in Bahia. Even within Brasília, inequality bloomed. The core of the city, what planners called the pilot plan, was pristine, geometric, elegant. But around its perimeter, improvised satellite cities sprang up. Ceilândia, Taguatinga, Samambaia. These were not part of Niemeyer's vision. They grew out of necessity, built by the workers who stayed after construction ended and by the government clerks priced out of the center. Over time, a socio-spatial divide hardened, a capital within a capital, one planned, one improvised. One seen, one hidden. And yet, for all its contradictions, Brasília worked, at least in the sense that it endured. The capital did not collapse, the republic did not fracture, but the dream, that utopian idea of a new Brazil born from dust and steel, that's more complicated. Because sometimes building a city is the easy part. The hard part is anchoring it to the lives and hopes of the people it claims to represent. And that perhaps is where the dust never truly settled. And that brings us back to the dust. The literal dust of Brasília's red soil, fine, dry, and stubborn, which clung to shoes, cars, and lungs. The same dust that coated construction sites, crept into government offices, and turned white shirts reddish-brown by midday. But more than that, it symbolized something deeper. The idea that even the most grandiose visions are never built on a clean slate. They're built on layers, of geography, of politics, of culture, of human error. And that dust, ignored by planners and dismissed by designers, became a quiet metaphor for everything they couldn't fully control. Because in the end, Brasília wasn't just about moving a capital, it was about moving an entire mindset, about uprooting a country's seat of power and trying to replant it in the middle of nowhere, in the hope that something new would grow. But power doesn't travel easily. It carries history, inertia, resistance. And when you try to transplant it, you don't just shift buildings, you shift balance, culture, conflict. The irony, that for all the ideals and blueprints, the final trigger may have been far more mundane than anyone admits. That in a decade filled with nationalist fervor, Cold War pressures, and grand developmentalist plans, one of the key reasons for the capital's relocation came down to something as prosaic as climate discomfort. Dust clogging the lungs of diplomats, heat disrupting cabinet meetings, embassies silently lobbying for change, not because of ideology, but because of air quality. Brasília may have been born out of visionary ambition, but it was accelerated by very human frustration. And that's the domino effect in its purest form. A president's long-held dream, a city's choking air, a construction deadline rushed by discomfort, and suddenly, a nation wakes up with a new capital. A capital that promised the future yet carried the flaws of the past. A capital whose story reminds us that history often hinges not on declarations or revolutions, but on particles of dust drifting through a sunlit corridor. So the next time you look at a map of Brazil or see the sharp geometry of the National Congress building, ask yourself, what really moved the capital? Was it progress, vision, or something far more granular? If you enjoyed this dive into the hidden chain reactions of history, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Domino Effect, where we uncover how the smallest cracks in the past shape the world we live in today.